Double stack previews coming up on the RotoWire Fantasy Football Podcast. Starting off with the AFC West, all coming up now. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the RotoWire Fantasy Football Podcast. I'm Jeff Erickson here with Nick Whalen. We're going to double stack our divisional previews, doing the AFC West and the AFC East today, starting off the AFC West and the defending Super Bowl champ, the Kansas City Chiefs. Big news starting off with the Chiefs right off the bat, Nick. Hollywood Brown suffered a tough shoulder injury in the preseason game. First play of the game against the Jacksonville Jaguars.
Well, that's what happens, Jeff, when you go up against the Teal Curtain defense, even in a preseason game. I mean, you got to expect to be hit hard. But no, I mean, for the most part, with 1 week of the preseason in now, we dodged any of the true, disaster injuries. Player X is out for the year. But this is a big one. His status for week one, absolutely in jeopardy, dealing with that shoulder injury. This is going to be one that we have to watch very, very closely over the next couple of weeks. But right now, it's looking like a setback for Hollywood Brown. I think it's very possible that he doesn't play in week one and could even be hampered over the first few weeks of the regular season. Now, we did see Xavier Worthy work with the starters in that preseason opener, and that happened even before Hollywood Brown went down. So if we're looking at a world in which Hollywood Brown, say, misses 2 or 3 games to begin the year, which is realistic, Xavier Worthy already working with the starters, that can kind of bump him up to wide receiver 2 status in that offense. And, we talked so much a couple of months ago, Jeff, speaking of the Chiefs receivers, about Rashee Rice and, man, are you drafting him? Are you crossing him off? I mean, it's been all quiet on that front. And it does kind of feel like we might be going down the Alvin Kamara road here, where this is not necessarily something that impacts him in 2024.
Right. It takes, justice moves slowly. They wait for real life justice to proceed before they finish off their own. Absolutely. And the whole emphasis, on this is that last year, the receiving core was horrible for Patrick Mahomes. Terrible. Horrible. And the whole emphasis was that we're going to improve his receiving core. Rice obviously made some gains. It was improved as the season continued. But, they were getting very little out of everyone else. They signed Hollywood Brown. They drafted Xavier Worthy. It's big. They got an aging Travis Kelce. So the whole point was improve the weapons that Patrick Mahomes has to work with.
I think they did that, especially if Rashee Rice is not suspended at all this season. It's hard to argue that it could be any worse than it was last year. Obviously, Rice not being suspended, if we do get that news confirmed at some point, I expect his ADP to rise quite a bit. And, obviously Hollywood Brown won't miss too much time. I'm still pretty high on him. And, we'll see what they're able to do with Xavier Worthy. I think Travis Kelce is kind of an interesting, I don't want to use the term question mark because it's Travis Kelce and he's been the most bankable asset at the tight end position for essentially the last decade. And, even after getting off to a pretty sluggish start in what was not a great year overall for this Chiefs offense, he's still finished as a tight end 3, right? And that was despite missing week 1. He didn't play in week 18 either. He was still tight end 3 in PPR scoring in terms of total points.
Right.
I do wonder, did they kind of try to manage his workload on the fly? Is that even something you can really do in the NFL? We hear about load management in the NBA all the time, but this is a Chiefs team with one singular goal, right? That is win 3 straight Super Bowls, do something that no team has done in a very, very long time. And, we saw Travis Kelce, kind of be a little more up and down than we were used to last season. He showed down the stretch and certainly in the playoffs that he still has that gear. The question is, do we trust him to have that usage and have that gear for most of the regular season?
Yeah. I think that's a great question. I feel like this is a one last hurrah type of season for him. The elite tight ends have actually aged pretty well. I think I go back thinking of like Tony Gonzalez, for instance, there.
Yeah. Antonio Gates. Sure.
And guys that, they did age pretty well. Tight end as a position, not necessarily, but the elite ones have. Maybe it's a survivor's bias in my mind here. Maybe that has something to do with it. But so I think for once, I feel like the price is pretty right. Yeah, he's usually tight end 2. Laporta goes 1, and Laporta's dinged up in his own right a little bit right now. Has some red zone issues, perhaps, or I should say, so much of his value stems from the red zone production last year. Can he sustain enough volume if the touchdowns go down? I kind of like the late third, early fourth round price that Travis Kelce comes with.
Yeah, I mean, you forget you had to pay a much higher price this time last year, and yeah, I think we are starting to see that, kind of across the market in general. Like there seems to be a little bit more realistic pricing in terms of expecting some decline, not only for tight ends but for some other positions as well. I mean, in the last week at the NFFC, he's going pick 38 overall. He's going a good 4 or 5 picks on average behind Sam Laporta. Still going quite a bit ahead of, the Trey McBrides, Dalton Kincaids, even Mark Andrews of the world, which I think is fair. But I'm not necessarily worried about Travis Kelce falling off a cliff. I'm not trying to expect some sort of devastating injury for Travis Kelce. I'm not predicting that. I just wonder, with the beefing up of this receiving core, do they not have to rely on Travis Kelce in almost a desperation situation, like it felt like they did down the stretch last season? Like if we expect the Chiefs offense to be a more well-oiled machine in terms of this passing game, I think the idea is that part of that is you're kind of protecting Travis Kelce. You're managing that asset as much as you can throughout the regular season. And when push comes to shove, if you need him late in the fourth quarter, yeah, he's going to be there. When it gets to playoff time, Travis Kelce is absolutely going to be Travis Kelce. He's going to be the guy that he's been throughout his postseason career. But that's one thing I've been considering with him. And again, the price makes it a lot easier to stomach this season.
Right.
Taking that risk in the third round or the fourth round as opposed to the first round, like the last couple of years, it's a lot different. But I do wonder, how much KC is really going to try to push this thing in the regular season, because if nothing else, they proved last year that everything could go wrong. This team can look like it is a disaster. They can no-show a game against the Las Vegas Raiders, and they can still flip that switch. They're the only team in the NFL that I feel comfortable saying that
right.
About, right? I mean,
right.
anything could happen
in that
season. As long as the Chiefs are in the tournament, they're going to be my favorite to win the Super Bowl. I mean, I think
we got to remember that, by the way,
right?
Because
yes, keep that in mind.
Yeah, I think some people forgot about that with these postseason contests and things of that nature. Isiah Pacheco is the clear number one at running back this year. There's no question about it this year. Does he get a workhorse volume? Is he someone that, you can count on as your RB1? He's currently drafted as the RB11 overall, going around that 2-3 turn.
Yeah, Pacheco's been a really interesting ADP case, I think, throughout the draft season and throughout the offseason specifically. I mean, in terms of the workload last year, you look at just where he ranked in terms of pure attempts. He did miss 3 games, so you have to keep that in mind. But, 205 rushing attempts last season. There's not that many backs that play all 17 games. In terms of success rate, you like the numbers there. Came in at about, the RB 12-ish, maybe a little bit higher. Some quarterbacks are in there as well, but over 50% success rate. You'll take that for Isiah Pacheco, especially in an offense that, again, was up and down for much of last season. You look at where he's going right now in the NFFC. He's kind of been on an island throughout draft season, right? You have that first tier running backs, and then you have your, ETN, Achane, Henry, Kyron Williams. Those guys typically go in round 2. Sometimes Pacheco will go in round 2. Sometimes he'll go in round 3, but there's a pretty significant drop off. I mean, almost a full round from Pacheco down to Rachaad White, Josh Jacobs, James Cook, guys like that. So Pacheco is kind of on his own island here. And I found that in all the drafts I've done, especially best balls, sometimes somebody will reach and grab him early. Sometimes he'll be there, for you in the middle of the third round. It is kind of an eye of the beholder situation. I love Isiah Pacheco, the runner. There's not a lot of competition here. That's the other thing, right? I mean, in terms of workload on paper, I think it should be there. It's like, I'm shocked that Clyde Edwards-Helaire is still hanging on to his roster spot, but he's technically their number 2. Beyond that, it's Deneric Prince, it's Keontae Ingram. I think as long as Pacheco stays healthy, all signs point to him being the workhorse.
I've been throwing some round 20 picks on Deneric Prince.
Yeah, I don't see why not. I mean, we know what CEH is at this point, right? And he filled in, a couple of those games where Pacheco missed last season. All of a sudden, CEH, you're reminded, like, all right, there's a reason this guy had the pedigree that he did, but he's obviously not going to be the player that we thought he would coming out of LSU. But no, I don't mind. Yeah, if you're in a deeper draft, throw something at Deneric Prince. I think he's the upside play if Pacheco were to get hurt.
Quickly, before we move on to the next team, Patrick Mahomes, and you're going to like this. I'm going to do a cross-sport comparison. I kind of think he is like Mariano Rivera. Maybe he doesn't have the most saves projected in a given season, but he should always be your number one closer. He should always be like, he's safely a top 5 quarterback every single year. The floor is always there.
Yeah. And, it says a lot that, last season was an abject disaster by Chiefs standards for this offense, specifically the passing offense. Patrick Mahomes finished as the QB8 in terms of total fantasy points. He was QB7 if you take the average. Did miss that Week 18 game, but that to me feels like the absolute floor. It cannot be worse than it was last season. I think they addressed the things they needed to address. Again, this Chiefs team has proven that it can win in different ways, right? I mean, they've won 2 Super Bowls without Tyreek Hill. They've won a Super Bowl with Tyreek Hill. They won a Super Bowl with a great passing offense. They've won a Super Bowl with a terrible passing offense. I'm not saying this return, we're not going to go back necessarily to Patrick Mahomes throwing 50 touchdowns this season, but it's not going to be as bad as it was last season. And I think he's being, for the most part, drafted appropriately, right? You're not getting the rushing out of Mahomes that you are from Hurts or Lamar. So I understand if you favor those guys, but yeah, I think, maybe outside of Josh Allen, he's still probably the safest fantasy investment in terms of combination of floor and ceiling.
Yeah. I lied. I did want to say one other thing defensively. No more Jarrett Sneed. He's now playing his wares in Tennessee. How bad of a loss is that?
It's certainly a loss. I mean, this is not a team that necessarily had a clear replacement. I think when you're a team like the Chiefs or the Niners, when you have these stacked rosters, those are just kind of the casualties that end up happening. They ended up paying Chris Jones, and when you do that and you have the Mahomes contract, you're just not going to be able to keep everybody. But the Chiefs have been pretty good as far as getting out, 1 year, maybe 1 year early on some of these contracts where other teams might give that guy the deal and then you pay for it on the back end. In terms of personnel evaluation, I mean, no team has done it better than the Kansas City Chiefs. And, you could argue, Tyreek Hill is still Tyreek Hill in Miami, but they've been able to win without him. It's been just fine. And I think they'll be all right without Jarrett Sneed. I think, he basically had the best possible season he could have last year. And as you know, Jeff, those, unless you're an ultra, Darrelle Revis elite cornerback, like those don't tend to be super sticky year over year. So I think Kansas City said, look, we're kind of selling high essentially on Jarrett Sneed. We're going to get out before there's maybe some potential decline. Now, early in the season, could there be some bumps in the road in that secondary? Absolutely. I'm not saying they're better without Jarrett Sneed. That's certainly not the case. But ultimately, given the cap constraints, given the other players that they have to think about on this roster, it's hard to argue with the move.
Yeah, they open with Baltimore and Cincy right away, so they're going to be those new corners are going to be tested right away. Najee Johnson, not Joshua Williams. You're going to see a lot of action early on there. All right, before we move on to the LA Chargers, got to take care of a quick note here. We have a new advertiser. We would like to welcome Fantasy Sports Knockout to the RotoWire podcast. It's Fantasy Sports Knockout, where a fantasy league meets a knockout pool, an innovative take on fantasy football. The concept is simple. Choose a new fantasy lineup each week and score points the same way you would in any fantasy league. But you must choose your players wisely. You can only use each player one time. The lowest weekly score or group of scores is eliminated from the contest every week. The concept may be simple, but survival is not. How will you play? Load up early or play the matchups and save the better players for later. Fantasy Sports Knockout. Can you survive the fantasy? Sign up at play.fantasysportsknockout.com today. The LA Chargers are next on our list. New head coach and Jim Harbaugh, celebrated head coach. Team did not look great in their first preseason game. It is the preseason for a reason, however. And of course, they're without their starting quarterback Justin Herbert right now. Not that he would play a lot in the preseason anyways, but this is they're adapting to trying to play without Herbert, hoping he'll be ready for the start of the season.
Well, he better not miss much time, if any, because this is a pretty disastrous quarterback room behind him, as we saw on full display this weekend. Chargers didn't do anything against this Seattle team in their preseason opener. They were 2 of 13 on third down. They had just 9 first downs on the game, 198 total yards. We saw Easton Stick. We saw ex-TCU star Max Duggan. We saw somebody named Luis Perez in that quarterback for the LA Chargers. This is not a deep team. It's a team that gutted, a lot of its veteran talent, obviously, this summer. And, interesting matchup for them in preseason week 1. You don't want to read a whole lot into preseason, but, something I've been looking at a lot, Jeff, on the Seattle side of things. That was their opponent, of course. Seattle ran 79 total plays. We're going to see a more up-tempo Seattle system this year. And I'm going to keep an eye on that throughout the preseason. I know this is not an NFC West pod, but something to monitor there. When it comes to the Chargers, I found myself investing in Josh Palmer. I found myself investing in Ladd McConkey. I think Palmer especially is a pretty nice value, given that I think there's a pretty realistic world in which he's their wide receiver 1. And I know we have concerns about what this offense is going to look like. It's Jim Harbaugh. They want to run the ball, yada, yada, yada. I still think being the number 1 wide receiver in a Justin Herbert-led offense is meaningful. And even if you think this is going to be one of the most run-heavy attacks in the NFL, which it very well could, I did a little digging last night, and you look at a team like the Falcons or the Bears. I mean, these were teams that were, I believe, second and third respectively in terms of total rush attempts last season. They had bad quarterback play between both of those teams, and they still finished right in the middle of the pack in terms of total passing yards. It's not like you're just completely sacrificing passing because you're a run-heavy team. And obviously, Justin Herbert is a much better quarterback than Justin Fields or Tyson Bagent or Desmond Ridder. So I'm trying not to fall into this narrative of, oh, the Chargers are just going to run the ball every time. They're going to be boring. There's not going to be anything there. I think there's still room for Josh Palmer and Ladd McConkey to produce in this offense. And you're getting Palmer right now as a wide receiver 55, widely available in the 120s and the 130s. He's become one of my favorite later round values at the position.
Yeah. I question the volume, but efficiency should be there. You think if they get a healthy Herbert though, and I think that's such a big, huge, massive if plantar fascia, he has a plantar fascia injury, and those tend to linger. Even when the player is capable of returning, you worry about whether it's going to affect his mobility. You worry about whether it's going to affect volume. This is a team that isn't expected to throw the ball a ton. Interesting that McConkey was held out of the opener, the preseason opener. He's got a lower body issue, but he did warm up. Same was true with Kimani Vidal, who did participate in warmups but didn't play in the game. So they kind of held out a couple of their interesting rookies.
Yeah, Vidal's a really interesting one too, and hard to say exactly, what preseason reps mean at this point, especially for a team like the Chargers that was just, kind of thrown in the towel for this game, without having Justin Herbert. And I choose to believe that holding Kimani Vidal out of this preseason opener is a good sign for him. There's been no sign that he was, injured or sick or anything like that. I think this was kind of a preservation move, for the Chargers. We did see Isaiah Spiller, who's technically competing with Vidal right now for that running back 3 spot to at least begin the year. I think it's a good sign for Vidal that he wasn't out there and Spiller was. We didn't see Gus Edwards. We didn't see J.K. Dobbins. So again, we don't want to read too deep into this, but as you know, Jeff, I've done a couple of videos on Kimani Vidal, and I really like him. I'll have another video coming this week talking about him. He's 5'8". He's a small school guy. He's a 6th-round pick. A lot of those guys tend to get lost in the shuffle, but this is a guy that was like right at the top of the country last season at Troy in terms of explosive play rate. He was way up there in terms of breaking tackles. He's a very, very good pass protector, especially for somebody who's only 5'8". He's got decent size to him, decent girth. The Chargers have already pointed that out throughout the preseason. And they bring in Greg Roman to be the OC. Obviously, Greg Roman has familiarity with both Edwards and J.K. Dobbins, but we know what Gus Edwards is at this point, right? Yeah. He's a fine, lower-level NFL starter. If you don't have anybody else, you got Gus Edwards. J.K. Dobbins, arguably the most injury-prone player at his position in the NFL. He's coming back from a torn Achilles. He's torn his LCL. He's torn his ACL. Is it really realistic to expect him to ever be the back that we thought he could be coming out of Ohio State? I don't think so. In deeper leagues, I'm holding Kimani Vidal. I'm certainly not expecting to get much out of him early in the year. In your home league, you don't even have to draft Kimani Vidal. I mean, he's going in like the 170s in ESPN leagues right now, but I do think there's going to be a time during the season, whether it's, week 6 or whether it's week 12, where Kimani Vidal is going to have some value. I think they're going to want that home run hitter, big play ability that Vidal brings. You're not getting that out of Dobbins or Edwards.
Yeah. And I when we talk about players like Vidal, it's definitely a point of reference that we always need to know the league context that we're in.
Yep.
You mentioned home leagues that might not need that there, where you only have 5-man benches. Whereas in the NFFC, in the RotoWire Online Championship since August 1st, there's been 33 drafts, and Vidal has been drafted in every single one of them. He's RB 55, but it just shows the depth. It's a 20-man roster, 9-man benches. Obviously, it's a little bit different there, but I think it's interesting, the range there. Gus Edwards, J.K. Dobbins, and Vidal. It's 40, 44, and 55 respectively. That's for their top. Someone's going to get those carries, and it's a Greg Roman offense. You figure they're going to figure out the running side of things at the very least. So someone should be a bargain in that range.
Yeah, you would think. And, I'm just expecting J.K. Dobbins to get hurt at some point. There aren't many players that I would firmly say that about, but he's just the track record speaks for itself. I think Vidal at some point is going to be at least the RB2 in this offense, depending on what they get out of Gus Edwards. But you're right. I mean, that ADP range, kind of speaks to the fact that nobody really knows at this point, but it could be a pretty decent running game, right? Greg Roman, combined with the investment that they've made on the offensive line, combined with the fact that they've, purged the roster of their top 2 pass catchers. Again, I'm in on Palmer at cost. I like Ladd McConkey. I think there's some upside there, but this is not the receiving core that it's been in years past, where you have, a big dog in Keenan Allen, and then you have this guy that everybody likes but always gets hurt and kind of underwhelms, and Mike Williams. Both those guys are out the door. We should mention Quentin Johnston, by the way. We're in firm Jalen Reagor territory with Quentin Johnston. Every report seems to be negative when it comes to him. I mean, early back in like March and April, I was grabbing some Quentin Johnston in best ball. I'm like, I liked him out of TCU. Like, he can't possibly be that bad again. The opportunity's there. It's looking like it might not be there, man. I think GJ Chark right now seems to have the upper hand over Quentin Johnston for the wide receiver 3 job for the Chargers.
Yeah, I keep trying to make Johnston happen, and it is year 2. It we got to remind ourselves it is year 2, but yeah, it's not great so far.
It's not looking good.
Yeah, it's a first round pick too. It's just it's really awful. That's the tough part there. All right, totals on there. So they're plus 320 for the AFC West, depending on where you're looking for over unders. It's either 9.5 or 8.5. What say you on these?
9.5 is, to me, a crazy number for the Chargers. 9.5? Where are they? 9.5? That is way too high, in my opinion. Let me see what I'm seeing at DraftKings here. I'm 8.5 at DraftKings, minus 155 to the over. That is.
See, I'm seeing 9.5 at DraftKings. Even I'm looking at our odds page, but maybe it hasn't updated yet. There.
Well, DraftKings has that thing where you could choose your number and the odds adjust. So you could get them at over 9.5 at plus 140, over 8.5 minus 155. Schedule wise, they don't have an overly difficult schedule. They actually have a chance to get off to a decent start here. They're home for the Raiders in week 1. They're at the Panthers in week 2. They're at the Steelers in week 3. These are all winnable games. They get the Broncos in week 5, the Cardinals in week 6, the Saints in week 7. So the schedule is a big part of the reason why that number is maybe a little bit higher. They get the Patriots later in the year. Essentially, to me, it's going to come down to, can they sweep the Raiders and the Broncos, right? I mean, those are the in-division games that you absolutely have to win. Obviously, you're going to be up against it anytime you're going up against Kansas City. I think there is a little bit of a Harbaugh bump here, as far as new coaches go. Right. And there's not this mystery with Harbaugh. It's like we know who he is. He's been one of the premier college coaches for the last decade. He's obviously won at the NFL level as well. So it removes some of the mystery from the equation. But I mean, I still think this is an under for me, even at 8.5. I think this is a 7 or an 8 win team. They're going to try to grind out wins. They're probably going to be a pretty low scoring team overall, which is not great for fantasy. But I think there's just a little bit too much upheaval on the offensive side. And every year, Jeff, this is a team that underwhelms and ends up getting hurt on defense, right? I mean, every single year, this is like one of the worst rush defenses in the NFL. And yeah, you still got Joey Bosa, who, by the way, is hurt right now. You still have Khalil Mack, who's just not really the same guy. The secondary is just, always kind of an issue. I think the Chargers will be an okay team. I think they'll be on the fringes of that wild card hunt, but I like the under.
Yeah. Raiders would like to remind everybody that the Chargers did not sweep the Raiders last year. In fact, emphatically didn't come close to sweeping them. That second game was ugly. We did that one. We were on air for that one there last year. It was a Thursday night special, if I recall correct. Or was it Monday night or Thursday night? But it was an Easton Stick game, and was the surreal score game. So anyways, we'll move on to the Raiders next. But first, a note from our friends at Circa. The biggest pro football contests in Vegas are back. Circa Survivor and Circa Million are now up to $16 million in guaranteed prizes. 2 ways to win and no rake. Circa Survivor contestants select one team each week with no point spread. Last the longest to win it all, with $10 million guaranteed. In Circa Million, make 5 picks against the spread each week for your share of $6 million guaranteed. Quarterly and full season payouts. Enter in Nevada. Play from anywhere. Visit circusports.com for details. We are also on the Blue Wire Network. Here are their ads. All right. Thank you for your patience with that. We move next on to the Las Vegas Raiders. Depending on where you look, win total is set at 6.5 or 7.5, plus 900 to win the AFC West. The AFC West has got the most the drastic drop off in odds for that there. But point is, this is a team that's not expected to win the division. They did beat the Chiefs on Christmas Day last year. Ugly game, which is the way they like it.
Yeah, that's who the Raiders kind of became, especially late in the season, as they adapted the Antonio Pierce mentality. And I think the big question is when you make a hire like Antonio Pierce, who seemingly, I wouldn't say change the culture, but at least change the identity for this team overnight. It's like, can you carry that over? And is that ultimately enough to keep you competitive? Just kind of this rah, we're going to hit you hard. We're trying to injure Patrick Mahomes mentality. It's like, does that actually work at the highest level in the NFL? I think 6.5 is an appropriate number for the Raiders. That they'll have some winnable games in division, just like the Chargers will, just like the Broncos will. Again, it's going to come down to the round robin essentially between those three teams. Don't expect them, to go out and beat the Kansas City Chiefs. Although over the last couple of years, the Raiders always tend to play the Chiefs pretty well, even when they're at a talent deficit. We got to start at quarterback, though, when it comes to the Raiders.
Absolutely.
And we did see both Minshew and Aiden O'Connell, in their preseason opener over the weekend. Both guys looked pretty decent. Wasn't a whole lot of takeaways there. They both saw similar reps. Minshew did throw a touchdown in their game against the Vikings. He was 6 of 12 for 117 yards and that score, which went to DJ Turner. O'Connell, he was 7 of 9 for 76 yards. So no real separation there. My guess is that Minshew gets first crack at the job. I would be very surprised if we make it through 18 weeks, Jeff, and we don't see both of these guys starting at some point.
That I agree with. And there might be like the mystery quarterback too, some third quarterback at some point in time too. I wouldn't be surprised if that happens. They did announce that they will, Antonio Pierce said that he plans to name the starting quarterback after Saturday's preseason game. So he may already even have an idea. They're both expected to play a quarter in that game against Dallas. So we'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, if Pierce has come out and said that, then that feels like perhaps the final audition. But like you said, he probably already has at least some thought in mind. And again, my guess is that would be Gardner Minshew. As you know, Jeff, I've been a little bit off of Davante Adams this year at cost. I've just, it's a combination of age. It's the combination of quarterback play, the very public idea that Davante Adams did not really sign up for what this situation has become in Las Vegas. He signed up to go play with Derek Carr. Derek Carr is now going into his second year as the Saints quarterback. He is not the Raiders quarterback. I don't think Davante Adams loves what's going on here. This might be his last true elite season physically, right? And we already did see a little bit of decline last year after that super elite season in 2022. Still got to burn a second round pick on him. He's in that, kind of mess with Drake London, Chris Olave, now Puka Nacua might slide into that range, but still going ahead of Nico Collins, Jalen Waddle, Michael Pittman. I think given the consistency of Davante Adams, and he's proven that he can still put up, 1,200 yards and 8 or 9 touchdowns with bad quarterback play. I get it, but there is a little bit more downside for me this season with Adams. Looking a little bit later in the draft, though, I have been all over Jakobi Meyers, who was playing some slot for them in the preseason opener this weekend. Wide receiver 53. So we're talking same range as Josh Palmer. He goes behind Tyler Lockett in some drafts. I don't really love that. I think for one, there's a world in which Jakobi Meyers ends up being the number one wide receiver for the Raiders if they do move on from Davante Adams, or rather if Davante Adams forces his way out, which I think is realistic. I know you don't see that a ton in the NFL, but I think that could happen this year. And Jakobi Meyers has done nothing but produce really, really high floor fantasy seasons with bad quarterback play his entire career.
Yeah, I agree. But the problem is it's going to be bad quarterback play again this year. I mean, no matter who emerges as the starter, I can't see either of them being better than league average. I don't see a good season coming from this. And I don't see a good amount of volume either. I think you're probably right because he's the clear number 2. And I'm probably not giving that enough credit. I haven't been getting him a whole lot. I've been clicking on like Khalil Shakir instead. I've been going, I think I'd take Brian Thomas instead. I think Palmer versus Meyers is an interesting debate because it's two teams that aren't going to have a whole lot of volume. Palmer ostensibly is the number 1 on that team, but we don't know that for sure. But I think it's pretty likely that he is, and we know for sure that Meyers is the number 2 though, and with the Raiders.
Yeah. And, I think we have to consider who the quarterbacks are. Like I'm not excited about Gardner Minshew or Aiden O'Connell, but these are guys that are willing to take chances. They're willing to air the ball out, right? It's not Zach Wilson and Easton Stick. Like it's not going to be good quarterback play, but I think it could be a little better for fantasy than real life, if that makes sense. Yeah, I don't think it's not going to be totally disastrous. Like there's going to be the 370-yard game for Gardner Minshew that he has every year. Like I think even though it might not be good for the Raiders in terms of their quest to make the playoffs in the AFC, I think it actually end up being a decent fantasy situation. And, Jakobi Meyers, like I mentioned, he's done nothing but produce with bad quarterbacks. He's been a top 30 wide receiver in PPR in each of the last 3 seasons. Again, he's being drafted, 20, 25 receiver spots behind that. He had 106 targets in 16 games last season. That's essentially the same number of targets that Nico Collins had last season. That's more targets than Brandon Ayuk had last season. So they might not be the most efficient targets, but the targets are going to be there.
Yeah. I can't get that Christmas Day game out of my head where O'Connell threw for 62 yards and they won.
Yeah, that was not his best effort.
No, but maybe that's just, I mean, he did throw for 299 the following week. So I guess I should probably be a little bit more charitable, but I feel like this is a team that wants to have games in the muck. And I guess I'm a little wary of that, but hey, year 2 might be a little bit different. They're adding weapons. They did draft Brock Bowers in the first round. So expect to have a better weapon at tight end as well now.
Yes, absolutely. And, again, it's preseason week 1. So take it with a block of salt, if you will. But I was really excited about what we saw out of Brock Bowers. I think he played 11 total snaps in the preseason opener. 6 of those came at tight end. 1 of those came in the slot. They used him in 2 snaps as an outside receiver, and he even lined up in the backfield twice, Jeff. He had a reception on a 3rd and 1 where he was lined up at fullback. It was basically an I formation. He was in at fullback, split out, got it to him in the flat, and he was able to pick up some yardage after the catch and get the first down. So there's been all this, talk of, well, they just drafted Michael Mayer a couple of years ago. He was a high pick out of Notre Dame, somebody that we liked. How are they going to use both these guys? For one, I think they're going to be in a ton of 12 personnel. I think they want both Mayer and Brock Bowers on the field alongside Davante Adams and Jakobi Meyers. And if this weekend was any indication, I think we're going to see Brock Bowers all over the field, right? He is that modern playmaking type of tight end where he's not just lined up at the edge of the line. He's going to be in the slot. He's going to be on the outside. Maybe they'll work him into the backfield like they did in the preseason opener. I think this is a very, very good sign as far as just getting him on the field, trying to get him as many touches as they can.
Brock Bowers or David Njoku?
Brock Bowers or David Njoku? Let me look at ADP real quick here.
Njoku's 10, Bowers is 11 among tight ends.
I think I'd chase the upside on Bowers. I think I would. They're going about 8 picks apart right now in the NFFC. I'm a Jake Ferguson guy. So if I don't get Jake Ferguson, who's the tight end 9 right now, and I'm shopping, then it's like Njoku, Bowers. Do you wait and try to get Freiermuth? I think as of right now, I would chase the upside on Bowers over Njoku.
Okay. I think I would as well, especially because I don't know if Njoku has that bond with Watson that he did with Flacco.
Right. And I just don't trust Watson in general.
Yeah. All right. Quickly, Zamir White is running back since August 1st is running back 21 in the RotoWire Online Championship. That puts him right behind James Conner, right ahead of DeAndre Swift. He's in that glob of, the RB20s, if you will. The argument with Zamir White is always, okay, who else do they have? Is that sufficient?
It could be a dangerous argument because we said the same thing about Alexander Mattison last year in Minnesota, right? It was like, Cook is gone. He's the guy. Like, even if we don't love him, he is the guy. And that kind of blew up in our faces. You could see something similar happening with Zamir White. I think you could argue that maybe he has a higher floor than Mattison, but as the 75th pick, I don't think you're paying a crazy cost. You look at the other running backs that go in that range, like you said, DeAndre Swift. After him, you got to make the Harris or Warren choice. You got Raheem Mostert, Tony Pollard going about a round later. I'm fine, taking Zamir White if he's my RB3 preferably. Sometimes he's going to end up being your RB2. I think there's a pretty defined ceiling here, though. I don't expect him to be putting up, peak Josh Jacobs numbers by any means. I don't think this is an overly impressive offensive line. I think this could be an offense that we've talked about that struggles overall. I don't see a 16 carries a game for Zamir White situation. I don't think the Raiders are going to be in those situations where that makes sense.
Who are you clicking on in that range instead?
James Conner, who goes like 5 picks ahead. I still like James Conner. I've kind of been beating the drum for David Montgomery, and I know there's extreme risk of touchdown dependency and some touchdown regression for David Montgomery, but I think the Lions found a formula that worked really well for them last season, which was, still kind of use Montgomery as the lead guy. I assume Jahmyr Gibbs will cut into that more than he did last season, especially like the first 6 or 7 weeks of last season. But David Montgomery was the far more effective runner in the red zone, inside the 10, inside the 5. Again, you're relying a lot more on touchdowns than you would like to for Montgomery, but I just don't think a whole lot changes for the Lions other than getting Gibbs just a bit more involved. And I think a lot of that could be as a pass catcher, not necessarily on the ground. Like, the Lions didn't go out and bring in Stephon Diggs where we're like, the passing volume is going to increase. Like, I think they found something that works really well. I think they have the best 1-2 in terms of backs that complement each other and make sense together. And I think it's completely possible that David Montgomery could come pretty close to replicating what he did last season.
Yeah, I can see that too. I have added Montgomery, especially when I've been doing like running back anchor try to plans there and fishing in this range quite a bit. We got the Denver Broncos coming up, but first, quick note from Fantrax. Is there something you wish your fantasy league had or features that are missing from your current leagues? Bonus scoring, custom schedules or playoffs, deeper team settings? Well, look no further because we have you covered with our friends at Fantrax. Fantrax is the most customizable fantasy platform in the industry, offering the greatest fantasy experience for your dynasty, keeper, redraft, and best ball leagues. Fantrax even offers college fantasy football leagues. Create or join a fantasy football commissioner league, invite your friends, and dominate your draft this season. Fantrax is the top dynasty fantasy football platform in the industry. Coming from another service? Not a problem. Fantrax can easily import any of your current leagues and rosters. Ever have a trade go wrong or make a mistake in dropping a player? Fantrax commissioner tools allow you to undo any move with one simple click. Fantrax is running a special promotion you don't want to miss. Sign up for free at fantrax.com/rotowire today to enter for your chance to win tickets for any regular season NFL game for you and your entire league, plus $6,000 in spending cash. That's right, tickets for your entire league. Simply create a new league or bring over your existing league for more chances to win. Simply go to fantrax.com/rotowire and sign up today. Fantrax, the home of fantasy sports. Nick Whalen and Jeff Erickson here. We are talking AFC West, and we got one team left, the Denver Broncos. Disaster of a season last year, the first year under Sean Payton. I mean, they're kind of digging themselves out from the trade, the Russell Wilson trade, and they finally cut bait on him. And so that's kind of the legacy that we're looking at here when we look at this team as a whole. Starting off with Bo Nix now taking the reins as likely as the starting quarterback.
I think likely is correct. They, of course, have Zach Wilson. They have Jarrett Stidham as well. But Bo Nix looked incredible, I thought, in the preseason opener yesterday. Broncos put up 34 points on the Colts. Bo Nix, 15 of 21 for 125 yards and a touchdown. Showed off the legs a little bit as well. 3 carries for 17 yards. I thought he looked about as polished and as sharp as he possibly could have in his first taste of NFL action. So I thought Bo Nix got off to a really good start. We'll see if that continues throughout the preseason. But if it does, I think they essentially have to roll him out there as the week 1 starter. And, you know, at this point, is Jarrett Stidham that much more of a high floor option in the short term? Certainly Zach Wilson isn't. I just don't think there's a ton of downside there, especially with Bo Nix being an older prospect. So if Nix is ahead of schedule, if he looks better than we expect him to, you know, that in some ways changes things for this offense. But at the same time, I think this is another team in this division that has a pretty defined ceiling for the season ahead. I think they're still looking forward, and that's kind of what you have to do when you back yourself into a corner with that Russell Wilson contract. There's a reason that their default win total at DraftKings right now is 5.5, and that is juiced to the under. I think this is viewed pretty unanimously as the team with the lowest floor in the division, although I think you could argue that for the Raiders as well, or even the Chargers if you're off of that team. But there's a lot of question marks here for the Denver Broncos. It's not really a fun team to evaluate for fantasy purposes, right? It's like you have a really boring but kind of dependable number 1 receiver in Courtland Sutton. You have just a total mess at running back right now between Javonte Williams, Samaje Perine, Jaleel McLaughlin, Audric Estime. Estime was the lead guy in the preseason game, 10 carries for 31 yards and a score, but didn't look overly explosive. That's not really the type of back that he is.
Also,
we did see everybody though.
Also, right. Well, we which is no good either.
No, it's not. And Samaje Perine, had a bobbled pass out of the flat, a really good throw by Jarrett Stidham that he just fumbled like 4 times, and that went into the hands of a Colts defender. So I don't think any running back really separated themselves in the preseason opener. Not that there's a whole lot of opportunity to do that, but this backfield is in the top 3, maybe number 1 in terms of most confounding right now for fantasy purposes. You'd like to think Javonte Williams gets that first look. I'm really not that interested in Perine. He's just the boring veteran of the group. There has been some Jaleel McLaughlin love. We like what we saw from him in short bursts last season. And, ultimately Estime, I think, works his way into the mix just because of how the situation breaks down. But I don't necessarily love him from a fantasy perspective. So I have really not been rostering any of these running backs. I got some late exposure to McLaughlin in best ball, but that's about it.
I have some Williams because his price is super affordable. And when you're doing the running back chicken game. I mean, he's always there for you. He's running back 31, and he's the first of the Denver running backs.
Yeah,
he was the guy. He got the first carries, though. It was interesting that Perine sometimes came in on passing downs. And McLaughlin came in and Estime were playing with the second team. That was noteworthy, although that might change. I think in fact, I'm almost certain it will change. But I also don't think McLaughlin is capable of shouldering more than like 10 to 12 carries in any given week.
No, I don't think so either. And that's kind of the rub with him, is that you like him in short bursts, but is he ever going to be, that workhorse type? Do they even want him to do that? I would say most likely not. But yeah, Javonte Williams, like you said, started the game. That's ultimately what's most important. And there is a decent gap between he and the rest of these Denver running backs. When you're looking at ADP, you see Javonte Williams go about, in the 90 to 95 range in the NFFC. McLaughlin, he hasn't come off the board until the 150s. So this is not, right. It's not the Steelers where you got two backs going back to back, or, Cleveland or Tennessee or these other ones where it's just kind of, take your pick and hopefully you're correct. The market dictates that Javonte Williams will have at least the first opportunity to be that guy. And, at cost, I don't think you're going to end up taking a major loss there. I mean, I would take him over Austin Eckler, who I'm just totally out on this year. And Eckler tends to go a little bit ahead of him.
Yeah. Yeah, agreed. I think this is a prove it year for Williams. I mean, you got to keep in mind, he played basically a full season after coming back from a double ligament tear in his knee.
Yep.
I think this is the year where he shows whether he has whether he can come back from that at all. He also was asked to do a lot of the grinding tough carries. And then that the problem is he probably will be asked to do that again. I mean, can the offensive line give him a little bit more space?
Right. That's the thing. I mean, the volume was fantastic, especially down the stretch. I mean, he had a 9-week stretch from week 8 to week 17 where he was averaging over 16 carries per game. The problem was he was giving you 3.2 yards per carry on those carries. And he was still giving you 3 catches a game as well. It's just, it's a volume versus efficiency equation when it comes to Williams.
Johnny Vang says Williams might have RB2 value, flex value. However, he doesn't want this committee. Reminds him like Pierre Thomas, Mark Ingram, and that crew there a couple of years ago. Yeah, I can see that there. Denver wide receivers. Courtland Sutton just got an extension. Jerry Jeudy is gone. Marvin Mims is next, I guess. Although it was interesting, Mims didn't come in right away yesterday. But I think it's interesting to see how they're going to play this out. If the quarterbacks are going to succeed, you got to figure these wideouts are going to be the ones that benefit the most. Who do you like here? Do you like Sutton at price? Is there any sleeper Denver wide receiver you do like?
Yeah, I mean, you'll see some Troy Franklin love, the rookie. He's going, well after pick 200 right now in an NFFC draft. So, that's kind of borderline. Mims, goes like 185, a little bit higher, but Denver has one of the biggest splits you will see between the number 1 receiver and the number 2 receiver in terms of ADP, almost 100 spots from Courtland Sutton down to Marvin Mims. And that's saying a lot because Courtland Sutton is the wide receiver 47, right? It's not like they have a guy who's going 7th and a guy who's going 60th. You got a guy who's the wide receiver 47, and then you get to the wide receiver 70s before you get to Mims and Franklin. I still think Sutton, in like the 8th round, I don't know. I'm okay with that. You look at the other receivers that go around him. It's like, Xavier Worthy, Roma Dunze, they go ahead of him. Those guys are, to me, wide receiver 3s in what should be much better offenses, sure. But I still tend to lean toward the wide receiver 1, even in a bad offense or a shaky offense at best, over the wide receiver 3 in what should be a better offense. Courtland Sutton versus Keon Coleman, Courtland Sutton versus Romeo Dobbs, Brian Thomas. These are decisions that you might have to make in your draft. I want the dependability of Courtland Sutton, although I do think he's maybe the only player on this roster who could get hurt by the absence of Russell Wilson. Like, that was the one guy that it seemed like Russell Wilson developed some chemistry with last season was Sutton, right? I mean, 10 touchdowns for Courtland Sutton a year ago. And a lot of those were just kind of like Wilson running around, and then just heaving it into the back of the end zone. And there's Courtland Sutton somehow getting his feet down. I don't know how sustainable those are year over year. Probably not very sustainable, considering Sutton had 4 total touchdowns over the previous 2 seasons. So that's something to keep in mind. It's like, maybe I would like to think there's a higher ceiling in terms of his yardage, but he's not going to go, 775 yards and 10 touchdowns again. That's just kind of that's the kind of ratio that you can't carry over year to year.
No, agreed. And the funny thing is, despite being the clear number 1 for his team last year, he only ended up with 59 catches, only had 772 yards. He's had 1 1,000-yard season ever. in 2019. I was ready to make the case that he's going too late. And then I kind of looked a little closer. I'm like,
yeah. No, I think he's appropriately priced if you were assuming some touchdown regression, right? And even if I think there's some yardage progression, we're not talking 1,200 yards. We're talking maybe an extra 150 yards over the course of the season. I mean, he played one more game last season than he did in 2022 and had like 20 fewer targets. I mean, it was a very, very strange fantasy year for Courtland Sutton. I think the fantasy numbers look better than some of the underlying numbers.
Didn't have a single 100-yard game last year.
No, only 2 double-digit target games.
Very weird. Very weird. Yeah. It's just not. It wasn't that deep of receiving core. That's the thing that kind of jumps to mind there. Tight ends. It's Troutman, Dulcich. I can't. Not much to say there.
No, I mean, Denver tight ends don't get drafted is what we could say, right? I mean, Greg Dulcich is the guy that has been drafted in the most NFFCs over the last 2 weeks, and he's gone in less than half of those. And we're talking, those are deep drafts where you're firing darts on a second or a third tight end late. In your ESPN home league, a Broncos tight end should not and likely will not be drafted.
Over under on 5.5 wins.
Man, 5.5. I think they win 4 or 5. I'll go under on 5.5. I think that's just a little bit too high. Again, it's a manageable schedule, partially because of the division. They get a game at home against Carolina midseason. Other than that, though, I mean, they have to play the AFC North. I don't really love that. I'm gonna go under. I think this is probably a 5-win operation.
All right, there you go. That's gonna wrap up our AFC West preview. And coming up in mere moments, in about 5 minutes, we're going to start up the AFC East for those of you streaming along with us. If you're listening to wherever you get your podcast, thank you for that. Either way, please like, review, and rate this podcast. As always, if you want to check out RotoWire, go to rotowire.com/pod. Big thanks to Circa, to all of our great sponsors, to Fantrax, and of course, our brand new sponsor, Fantasy Sports Knockout. Thanks for listening to the RotoWire AFC West preview, AFC East preview coming up next.